Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village is a quiet block in December, the kind of street where funeral homes do steady business, and the people who gather there understand the unwritten rules that govern respect, obligation, and the consequences of violating both. On December 5th, 1985, Scarpaci Funeral Home in Brooklyn was filled with men who had built their lives around those rules, men who understood that when an underboss dies, the boss attends the funeral. This is not a courtesy. This is not optional. This is the structure that keeps a criminal organization from tearing itself apart. Agnello Dellacroce was in the casket. Paul Castellano was not in the building, and John Gotti, standing near the front of the room with grief written across his face and calculation running behind his eyes, understood exactly what that absence meant. The man who had held the Gambino crime family together for 9 years through loyalty to a structure that had passed him over for promotion was dead. The man who should have been standing at the head of the mourners, acknowledging that loyalty and honoring that service, had chosen to stay away. What looked like a failure of protocol was actually a declaration. Agnello Dellacroce died of lung cancer on December 2nd, 1985. 14 days later, Paul Castellano was shot to death outside a Manhattan steakhouse in the most infamous mob killing in modern American history. The funeral was the hinge between those two deaths. The casket was closed, the prayers were said, and the family that Agnello Dellacroce had spent 28 years holding together was about to come apart in the most violent way possible. Drop where you are watching from in the comments below. It is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this. If you are new here and want more history like this delivered straight to you, subscribe now. Back to Brooklyn, December 5th, 1985, and the funeral that made a murder inevitable. Agnello Dellacroce was born on March 15th, 1914, in Venice, Italy, and arrived in New York as an infant to a country that would spend the next 7 decades trying to convict him of something that would stick. His family settled in Little Italy, the lower Manhattan neighborhood that in the 1920s and 30s was less a geographic location than an organizational territory, a place where the distinction between the street and the structure was maintained only when federal agents were watching, and sometimes not even then. His parents called him Agnello. The neighborhood wore it down to Neil. By the time he was old enough to understand what the men in the social clubs were actually doing, he was already part of the world they controlled. Prohibition was the economic engine that built modern American organized crime, and Dellacroce came of age inside that engine. His first arrest came in the 1930s. His second came shortly after. The specific charges varied: receiving stolen goods, illegal gambling, assault. But the pattern was consistent. A young man being trained in the methods and rhythms of a criminal organization that had learned how to survive law enforcement attention by never putting everything in one place and never trusting anything to paper. By the time he was in his 20s, Dellacroce had become associated with Albert Anastasia, the man who controlled the waterfront, ran the enforcement arm that the newspapers would later call Murder Incorporated, and understood that the most effective way to maintain organizational discipline was to make examples memorable and permanent. Anastasia ran what was then called the Mangano crime family, one of the 5 New York organizations that Lucky Luciano had established in 1931 when he ended the Castellamarese War and created the Commission to mediate disputes and prevent the kind of open warfare that brought federal attention. Dellacroce became a made member under Vincent Mangano. When Mangano disappeared in April of 1951 and was never seen again, and when Albert Anastasia took over the family shortly thereafter, Dellacroce transitioned smoothly into the new regime. This was a skill that would define his entire career: the ability to survive leadership changes, to serve whoever held power, to make himself indispensable without making himself a threat. Anastasia was murdered on October 25th, 1957, shot to death in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan in broad daylight while getting a shave. The killing was planned by Vito Genovese and carried out with the knowledge, if not the active participation, of Carlo Gambino, Anastasia's underboss. Gambino took control of the family within days. The organization that had been the Mangano family, then the Anastasia family, now became the Gambino family, the name it would carry for the next 7 decades. Dellacroce, who had served Mangano and Anastasia, now served Gambino. He was promoted to captain, then to underboss sometime in the late 1950s. The exact date is less important than the fact of it. Agnello Della Croce became the second-ranking member of what would become the largest and most powerful Mafia family in the United States, and he held that position for approximately 28 years under two different bosses. He was known by then as the Tall Guy and Father O'Neill, the second nickname a reference to his role as elder counselor and confessor within the organization. He was not unusually tall, perhaps 5 feet 10 inches or 6 feet, but in the world he inhabited, presence mattered more than measurement. He had a reputation for violence in his younger years, the kind of reputation that kept people careful and conversations respectful. By the time he became underboss, the violence was mostly behind him, but the memory of it was enough. He married Lucille Riccardi. They had 2 sons, Armand and Ronald. He also maintained a second family with a woman named Sandy Connolly, later Sandy Grillo, and they had a daughter, Shannon, born in the 1970s, when Della Croce was already in his 60s. The two-family arrangement was known within the organization but not discussed. This was the kind of operational compartmentalization that Della Croce understood instinctively and that the younger generation, particularly John Gotti, never quite mastered. His headquarters was the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy, a narrow storefront with a card table, an espresso machine, and very little else. It was unremarkable by design. The men who gathered there were not unremarkable, and the business conducted inside those walls generated millions of dollars annually through loan, sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, and the systematic extraction of money from every commercial enterprise that required permits, union labor, or protection from the kind of problems that organizations like the Gambino family were uniquely positioned to either create or prevent. Della Croce lived modestly compared to the wealth he controlled. He did not build mansions or accumulate visible assets. He understood that the most effective way to avoid prosecution was to avoid giving prosecutors anything to photograph, anything to seize, anything that demonstrated the gap between reported income and actual lifestyle. He was respected across all 5 New York families, not just his own. This respect was built on decades of reliability, discretion, and a willingness to honor the organizational rules, even when those rules worked against his personal interest. When disputes arose between families, Della Croce was the kind of man other bosses trusted to mediate fairly. When the commission needed someone to deliver a message or enforce a decision, Della Croce was the kind of underboss who could be sent without creating additional problems. He was old school in a way that would become rarer with each passing decade, a man who believed that the structure mattered more than any individual within it, that loyalty to the organization was the price of membership, and that the moment you started believing your own ambition was more important than the rules that governed everyone else, you had started the process of destroying yourself. On October 15th, 1976, Carlo Gambino died of natural causes at his home, and the decision he made about who would succeed him guaranteed that the family Della Croce had helped build would eventually destroy itself. Carlo Gambino had a choice to make about succession, and the choice he made was his brother-in-law over the man who had served as underboss for nearly 2 decades. The traditional path was clear. Agnello Della Croce was underboss, had been underboss since the late 1950s, commanded the respect of the family's soldiers and captains, understood the operations intimately, and had demonstrated loyalty through multiple regime changes. The logical successor was standing right there. Gambino chose Paul Castellano instead. Castellano had been born on June 26, 1915, in Brooklyn, the son of a butcher, and had entered organized crime through the same neighborhood networks that produced most of the family's leadership. His qualification for the boss position, beyond his competence in the rackets he controlled, was his marriage to Carlo Gambino's sister. The succession was nepotism, and everyone involved understood it as such. The arrangement that followed was an attempt to manage the resentment that nepotism creates. Castellano became boss, Dellacroce remained underboss, but the family was effectively split. Dellacroce was given control of the traditional street rackets, the crews that ran lone, sharking and gambling and hijacking and labor racketeering, the Manhattan based operations that looked like what organized crime had always looked like. He controlled approximately 10 crews. Castellano took the more lucrative white collar operations, the construction rackets, the concrete industry, the bid rigging schemes that generated millions by controlling who built what in New York City and at what price. He controlled approximately 12 to 13 crews and the institutional relationships that made those crews profitable. The total family at its height in the early 1980s consisted of approximately 250 to 300 made members, making it the largest of the five New York families. Castellano lived in a mansion at 177 Benedict Road on Tot Hill in Staten Island, a white columned house set back from the street that the FBI and the press called the White House. It had a swimming pool, manicured grounds, and the kind of visible wealth that Dellacroce had spent his entire career avoiding. Dellacroce stayed at the Ravenite in Little Italy, in the neighborhood where he had grown up, among people who had known him for 50 years. The contrast was not just geographic, it was philosophical. Castellano approached organized crime as a business, something to be managed from a distance with the same corporate structure and cost benefit analysis that legitimate enterprises used. He wore expensive suits, held meetings that resembled board sessions, and focused on operations that generated maximum profit with minimum risk of violence. Dellacroce approached organized crime as a culture, something you lived inside, where relationships mattered as much as revenue and respect was earned through presence and consistency. The split created structural problems that grew more severe the longer Castellano remained in power. The crews under Dellacroce resented taking orders from a boss they saw as distant, detached, and more interested in construction contracts than in the soldiers who did the actual work of enforcement and collection. The crews under Castellano saw Dellacroce's faction as dinosaurs, street-level criminals who didn't understand that the real money was in the legitimate economy and that the future of organized crime was infiltration, not intimidation. Both sides were partly right. The tension between them was held in check by one thing: Agnello Dellacroce's loyalty to the structure. He could have started a war when Gambino passed him over. He had the support, the respect, the operational control to split the family in half and take his faction independent. He chose loyalty instead. He accepted the arrangement, enforced it among his crews, and made it work through sheer force of authority and discipline. The arrangement worked because Dellacroce made it work, and the moment he could no longer make it work, everything he had built would collapse in exactly 14 days. Among the men who operated under Dellacroce's protection was a hijacker and street enforcer from Ozone Park, Queens, who had been born in the South Bronx on October 27th, 1940, and who would describe Dellacroce for the rest of his life as the only father figure he had ever known. John Gotti grew up in poverty, one of 13 children, in a family where organized crime was not a career path, but simply the most visible and most profitable option available to boys who were smart enough to see how the neighborhood actually worked. He dropped out of school, he ran with street gangs, he was arrested repeatedly for hijacking, assault, and a series of progressively more serious crimes that marked him as someone who was willing to use violence and capable of managing the consequences. He became a made member of the Gambino family in the early 1970s. He operated under Dellacroce's faction from the beginning. The crew he joined was based at the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, a storefront on 101st Avenue that functioned the same way the Ravenite functioned in Manhattan, as a headquarters, a gathering place, and a location where business was conducted in the language and according to the rules that governed that business. By the mid to late 1970s, Gotti had been promoted to captain, running his own crew, answerable directly to Dellacroce. The promotion was Dellacroce's doing. He saw in Gotti something that reminded him of his own younger self: ambition, intelligence, willingness to do what the organization required, and a commitment to the old school methods that Castellano was systematically abandoning. Gotti's closest friend was Angelo Ruggiero, another Ozone Park kid who had grown up with Gotti and followed him into the life. Ruggiero was loud, profane, and loyal, the kind of man who would do anything for a friend and who lacked the instinct for discretion that kept most career criminals out of prison. Gotti trusted him completely. That trust would eventually put both of them and the entire crew in a position where only Dellacroce's protection kept them alive. The relationship between Gotti and Dellacroce went beyond the professional. Gotti's own father was not involved in organized crime, had no connection to the world his son had entered, and could not provide the kind of guidance that world required. Dellacroce filled that role. He mentored Gotti, advanced his career, protected him when protection was needed, and taught him the operational methods that had kept Dellacroce himself out of prison for decades. Gotti visited Dellacroce frequently, sought his counsel on family business, and deferred to his judgment in ways he deferred to no one else. The loyalty Gotti felt toward Dellacroce was genuine, personal, and absolute. It was also strategic. Gotti understood by the early 1980s that his crew's activities, particularly their involvement in narcotics trafficking, were putting them in direct conflict with Paul Castellano's stated policies, and that the only thing preventing Castellano from moving against them was the man who had made Gotti a captain in the first place. The Berrigan crew ran the rackets that street crews had always run: hijacking trucks, loan sharking, gambling, labor racketeering, collecting protection payments from businesses that understood the cost of refusing. They were also, despite the official family ban, deeply involved in heroin trafficking. This was not unusual. The ban on drugs was Castellano's policy, announced with great formality and supposedly enforced with the death penalty for violations. In practice, the ban was selectively enforced, more about control and optics than morality. Castellano himself profited indirectly from drug operations. He simply didn't want the increased law enforcement attention that narcotics investigations brought, and he didn't want his own name attached to that attention. The contradiction was obvious to everyone in the family. The younger members, particularly those in Dellacroce's faction, ignored the ban when it suited them, and understood that as long as they didn't create problems, Castellano would look the other way. What Gotti understood by the early 1980s was that the only thing standing between him and Paul Castellano's growing list of people who needed to be removed was the man who had made him a captain, and that man was dying. By the early 1980s, Paul Castellano had established a rule that he claimed was absolute. No member of the Gambino family was permitted to engage in narcotics trafficking, and the penalty for violation was death. The rule was announced at family meetings, reiterated by captains, and presented as non-negotiable. Behind the public prohibition was a more complex reality. Castellano profited from drug operations through the crews that operated under his authority. He simply ensured that his own involvement was distant enough, mediated through enough intermediaries, that no prosecutor could draw a direct line from the heroin on the street to the boss in the mansion on Tot Hill. The ban was about liability management, not principle. It was selectively enforced against people Castellano wanted removed and ignored when enforcement would have been inconvenient. Many members of Dellacroce's crews were involved in heroin trafficking despite the official ban. Angelo Ruggiero ran a significant operation, importing heroin and distributing it through networks that stretched across New York and into New Jersey. The profits were substantial. The risks were also substantial, but Ruggiero and the others involved calculated that the risks from law enforcement were manageable and that Dellacroce's protection would handle any internal family consequences. They were half right. By the early 1980s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had placed Ruggiero's home in Howard Beach under electronic surveillance. The bugs captured hundreds of hours of conversations. Ruggiero, who had never learned when to stop talking, discussed drug deals, family business, and a range of criminal activities in detail and at length, all of it recorded by agents who understood they were building a case that could dismantle significant portions of the Gambino family's operations. When the investigation became known within the family, Castellano demanded to hear the tapes. The official reason was to assess the extent of the drug violations and determine who needed to be disciplined. The actual reason, which everyone involved understood, was that Castellano wanted to know if anyone on those tapes was talking about him, discussing his involvement in operations, or saying anything that could be used against him in the federal prosecution he knew was coming. The demand created an immediate crisis. Turning over the tapes to Castellano would expose Ruggiero and others in Gotti's crew to federal drug charges. It would also violate legal restrictions around the disclosure of intercepted communications, but refusing to turn over the tapes would be seen as insubordination, a direct challenge to the boss's authority. Agnello Dellacroce refused to let Castellano have the tapes while he was alive. He protected Ruggiero, protected Gotti's crew, and made it clear that as long as he was underboss, Castellano would not move against men who operated under Dellacroce's authority without going through Dellacroce first. Castellano wanted to kill Ruggiero. He wanted to break up Gotti's crew entirely, scatter the members, eliminate the faction that was most openly resentful of his leadership. Dellacroce held the line. The tension between Castellano and Gotti's faction escalated through the early 1980s, each side understanding that a confrontation was inevitable, but neither willing to move, while Dellacroce was still in position to enforce the uneasy peace he had maintained since 1976. By mid-1985, Dellacroce was seriously ill. The lung cancer that would kill him was already advanced. His ability to mediate, to protect, to hold the two factions apart through sheer force of personal authority was failing, along with his health. Everyone involved understood the timeline. When Dellacroce died, Castellano would move against Ruggiero and Gotti. When Dellacroce died, the protection that had kept the Berrigan crew alive would disappear. The question was not whether there would be a confrontation. The question was who would move first. The protection that kept Angelo Ruggiero alive and John Gotti in position was not a policy or a structure, but a single dying man, and by the fall of 1985, everyone involved understood that the protection had an expiration date measured in weeks. On February 25, 1985, federal prosecutors filed an indictment that charged the leadership of New York's 5 Mafia families with operating a criminal enterprise through the Commission, and Paul Castellano was listed as one of the principal defendants, facing what could amount to life in prison. The case became known as the Mafia Commission Trial. It charged Castellano, along with the bosses or acting bosses of the Genovese, Colombo, and Lucchese families, with racketeering conspiracy, extortion, labor payoffs, and a pattern of criminal activity that federal prosecutors argued demonstrated the existence of a national criminal organization coordinating illegal enterprises across state lines. The specific charges against Castellano involved the concrete industry in New York City, where the Gambino family and others had established a system of bid rigging that controlled which companies received contracts, at what prices, and with what profit margins built in for the families that ran the system. The other defendants included Anthony Fat Tony Salerno, who was listed as boss of the Genovese family, but was actually a front for Vincent Gigante, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, and Anthony Corallo of the Lucchese family. The trial was designed to decapitate the leadership of organized crime in New York by removing the bosses simultaneously and demonstrating that the commission itself was a criminal conspiracy. The potential sentence for Castellano was life imprisonment, even if he avoided conviction on the most serious charges, the legal fees, the time spent preparing for trial, and the likelihood of at least some convictions made it clear that Paul Castellano's ability to run the Gambino family was going to be severely constrained for the foreseeable future. The federal pressure created a leadership crisis at exactly the moment when Castellano needed unity within his own organization. He was fighting on two fronts: federal prosecutors who had assembled a comprehensive case against him, and his own family members who resented his leadership and were waiting for him to show weakness. The indictment was that weakness. A boss under federal indictment loses authority. A boss facing life imprisonment loses the ability to command loyalty from soldiers who understand that he may not be in a position to reward that loyalty or punish disloyalty. Castellano needed his captains and crews to remain disciplined, to continue generating revenue, and to avoid creating additional problems that would give prosecutors more ammunition. What he had instead was a divided family, a dying underboss who was the only person holding that division in check, and a faction led by John Gotti that was already calculating what would happen when Dellacroce could no longer protect them. One of the reasons Castellano would later give for not attending Agnello Dellacroce's funeral was his concern about being photographed by federal agents, about creating additional evidence that could be used against him at trial, about being seen in public at a gathering of known criminals while under indictment. The concern was legitimate. The FBI photographed mob funerals routinely. The photographs were used to map organizational relationships, identify new members, and establish patterns of association that could be introduced as evidence in racketeering trials. But the concern was also insufficient. The boss attends the underboss's funeral. This is not a suggestion. This is not contingent on convenience or legal strategy. This is the institutional obligation that demonstrates respect for the deceased, acknowledges the service he provided, and signals to the entire organization that the structure still functions according to the rules everyone agreed to follow. By the fall of 1985, Paul Castellano was facing life imprisonment from federal prosecutors, potential assassination from his own family members, and the imminent death of the only person who had prevented the second threat from becoming the first, and he appears to have understood none of this clearly enough to do anything about it. While Paul Castellano prepared for trial and John Gotti calculated what would happen when the protection died, Agnello Dellacroce was dying in exactly the way a man who had smoked heavily for 5 decades would die. The lung cancer diagnosis had come sometime earlier, in 1985. The exact timing is less clear than the progression. By spring, he was noticeably ill. By summer, he was being hospitalized. By fall, he was spending more time in Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens than at the Ravenite, and the men who came to visit him understood they were watching the end of an era play out in a hospital room, with beeping monitors and morphine drips instead of on the street where most men in his position met their conclusions. He continued to conduct some family business from the hospital when his condition allowed it. Visitors came regularly, captains seeking guidance, soldiers paying respects, men who had known him for decades and who understood that when he died, something fundamental about the organization would die with him. The visits were monitored by nurses who had no idea who their patient actually was, recorded in visitor logs that the FBI would later subpoena, and conducted in the careful language that men in that world used when they understood that every conversation might eventually be played in a courtroom. John Gotti visited frequently during Dellacroce's final illness. The visits were personal, the grief genuine, and the calculations unavoidable. Gotti was losing the man who had mentored him, protected him, and made his career possible. He was also losing the only barrier between himself and Paul Castellano's determination to dismantle his crew, kill Angelo Ruggiero, and eliminate the faction that most openly challenged Castellano's authority. The visits were about saying goodbye to a father figure. They were also about understanding that when the goodbye was final, survival would require action that Dellacroce himself, loyal to the structure even when the structure had passed him over, would never have approved. Paul Castellano's relationship with the dying Dellacroce during this period was distant. There is no record of frequent visits, no indication that the boss felt the same obligation to be present that Gotti felt. The contrast was noticed. In an organization where respect is currency and gestures carry meaning that extends far beyond their immediate context, Castellano's absence from Dellacroce's bedside was read as indifference, the same indifference that had characterized his leadership style, the same distance that had alienated the street crews, the same failure to understand that loyalty is a transaction that requires both parties to invest in the relationship. By late November 1985, Dellacroce's condition had deteriorated to the point where death was measured in days, not weeks. Family members began gathering. The awareness spread through the Gambino organization that the end was near. Conversations that had been theoretical became urgent. Plans that had been contingent became active. The question that had been circulating quietly for months, what happens when Dellacroce dies, was about to be answered, and the answer was being written by men who understood that in the window between his death and whatever Castellano did next, they had one chance to act. By the first days of December 1985, Agnello Dellacroce was 71 years old, had served as underboss of the Gambino family for 28 years, and had perhaps hours left to live. And the question that mattered to everyone except the man in the hospital bed was what would happen the moment he stopped breathing. Agnello Dellacroce died at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens on December 2nd, 1985, 71 years old, and the news reached John Gotti within minutes. The cause was lung cancer, the end of a process that had been visible for months, but that still registered as a seismic event within the Gambino family. An underboss dies, particularly an underboss who had held the position for nearly 3 decades, and the organizational implications extend far beyond the personal loss. Dellacroce had been the stabilizing force, the elder statesman, the man whose authority kept conflicts from escalating into violence. His death created a vacuum that Paul Castellano would now have to fill, and everyone who understood the family's internal dynamics knew that Castellano lacked both the respect and the relationships to fill it successfully. The news spread through the family rapidly. Captains called their crews. Soldiers who had served under Dellacroce for years absorbed the information with a mixture of genuine grief and immediate calculation about what came next. Funeral arrangements began within hours. The wake would be held at Scarpaci Funeral Home in Brooklyn. The schedule was set. Wake on December 4th and 5th. Funeral service on December 5th. This was a traditional Italian-American Catholic funeral, the kind of elaborate multi-day event that the Mafia had turned into institutional ritual. Attendance was not optional. For a maid member to miss the wake or funeral of an underboss without extraordinary justification was a violation of protocol that would be remembered and held against him. Paul Castellano, as boss, would be expected to attend. Expected is insufficient as a description. Required is more accurate. The boss stands at the front of the room during the wake, receives condolences, acknowledges the loss, and demonstrates to everyone present that the organizational hierarchy remains intact despite the death of one of its most important members. The boss delivers or arranges for the eulogy. The boss ensures that the funeral reflects the respect the deceased earned during his life. This is not discretionary. This is how the structure functions. John Gotti's immediate reaction combined grief with strategic awareness. He had lost the man he considered a father. He had also lost the protection that had kept him alive for the previous several years. Within hours of Dellacroce's death, Gotti was having conversations with other Gambino captains, assessing who could be trusted, who would support a move against Castellano if such a move became necessary, and whether it was already too late to prevent Castellano from acting first. Frank DeChico, a Gambino captain who was close to Castellano but who had his own concerns about Castellano's leadership, became a key figure in these conversations. Sammy Gravano, another captain with his own crew and his own resentments about how Castellano ran the family, was also brought into the discussions. The question being asked was not whether Castellano would move against Gotti's crew. The question was whether they could move against Castellano first and survive the consequences. The calculation was not just strategic, it was emotional. Gotti had just lost the most important person in his professional life. The rage and grief were genuine. They were also fuel. Within days, possibly within hours, of Dellacroce's death, the decision to kill Paul Castellano had moved from theoretical to operational. The planning would happen over the next 2 weeks. The justification was already in place. Castellano was weak, distant, unpopular, under federal indictment, and about to move against Gotti's crew. The emotional catalyst, the final element that made the decision irreversible, would come 3 days later at a funeral home in Brooklyn. The wake was scheduled to begin on December 4th, the funeral service for December 5th, and by the time John Gotti walked into Scarpaci Funeral Home to pay his respects, he had already begun asking the questions that would lead to Paul Castellano's death 11 days later. The funeral took place on December 5th, 1985, at Scarpaci Funeral Home in Brooklyn, and the gathering represented a nearly complete roster of Gambino family, leadership, soldiers, and associates, with one notable absence. The turnout was massive. This was not just a funeral. This was a demonstration of organizational continuity, a public acknowledgement of Dellacroce's importance, and an opportunity for every faction within the family to assess every other faction and understand where the power alignments would settle now that the man who had held them in balance was gone. Gambino captains filled the room. Frank DeSico, Sammy Gravano, and others who controlled crews across New York and New Jersey. Soldiers and associates from Dellacroce's faction were heavily represented. The Ravenite crew, the Bergen crew, the men who had operated under his protection and who understood that his death changed everything about their position within the family. The funeral followed traditional Italian-American customs: open casket, elaborate flower arrangements, prayers recited by a priest, eulogies delivered by family members and close associates. The atmosphere was somber, respectful, and charged with the kind of tension that appears when men who have built their lives around violence and calculation gather in a space where they are expected to show vulnerability. Agnello Dellacroce had been respected across the entire family, not just within his own faction. Even members of Castellano's crews, even men who had no personal loyalty to Dellacroce, recognized that he had been one of the last connections to the old ways, to the era when the Gambino family was run by men who understood the street and who commanded respect through presence, rather than corporate organizational charts. John Gotti was visibly emotional. Multiple sources who attended the funeral confirmed that his grief was obvious, profound, and personal. He stood near the casket for extended periods. He received condolences from other mourners. His face showed the kind of anguish that does not get manufactured for public consumption. Whatever calculations were running behind that grief, the grief itself was real. He had lost a mentor, a protector, and the closest thing to a father he had known in the life he had chosen. Paul Castellano did not attend the wake. Paul Castellano did not attend the funeral service. This absence was noticed immediately, discussed in whispers during the wake, and assessed by every captain and soldier present as a statement about Castellano's priorities and his respect, or lack of respect, for the man in the casket and the faction that man had led. In Mafia culture, where ritual and gesture carry institutional weight, where respect is the foundation of loyalty, and loyalty is the only thing that prevents an organization from fracturing into competing violent factions, the boss's absence from an underboss's funeral is not a scheduling conflict. It is an insult. It is a violation of the unwritten rules that everyone agreed to follow when they took the oath. It is the kind of mistake that gets remembered, that shifts allegiances, and that gives men who were looking for justification exactly the justification they need. The reasons Castellano gave for his absence, when asked later, centered on his concerns about federal surveillance. He was under indictment. The FBI photographed mob funerals. Being seen at Agnello Dellacroce's funeral would create evidence that prosecutors could use to demonstrate his ongoing involvement with organized crime, his continued leadership of the Gambino family, his association with known criminals. The concerns were not invented. They were real. They were also insufficient. Other bosses under indictment had attended funerals of high-ranking members and dealt with the photographic consequences. The obligation to attend outweighed the risk of being photographed. What the absence actually communicated, regardless of Castellano's stated reasons, was that he did not care enough about Agnello Dellacroce or the men who had served under him to accept even minimal risk on their behalf. John Gotti's reaction to the absence was rage. Multiple sources, including later testimony from cooperating witnesses, confirmed that Gotti was furious. He saw the absence as the ultimate disrespect to the man who had mentored him, protected him, and held the family together while Castellano sat in his mansion and counted money from construction contracts. The absence made it personal in a way that the strategic calculations about survival and the drug tapes and Castellano's plans to dismantle his crew had not quite made it personal. This was about honor, about respect, about the rules that were supposed to govern how men in that world treated each other. Castellano had violated those rules in the most public way possible. Conversations during the funeral, in the hallways outside the main room, in the parking lot, in cars parked on the surrounding streets, moved from grief to strategy. Gotti talked to Frank DeCicco. He talked to Sammy Gravano. He talked to others whose names would later appear in indictments and testimony. The consensus forming among them was that Paul Castellano had to be removed. The absence at the funeral gave them the justification they could use with other family members, with the captains and soldiers who might have opposed a move against a sitting boss under normal circumstances. This was not normal. The boss had disrespected the underboss. The boss had shown that he did not value the men who did the actual work of the family. The boss had demonstrated that he cared more about his own legal problems than about the obligations that held the organization together. By the end of the funeral, the conspiracy was in motion. Specific planning would happen over the next 10 days. The logistics of the murder, the selection of the shooters, the choice of location and timing, all of that would be worked out in the conversations that followed. But the decision itself, the commitment to kill Paul Castellano, was made at Scarpaci Funeral Home on December 5th, 1985, in the presence of Agnello Dellacroce's body and in the absence of the boss, who should have been there to mourn him. When the funeral ended and the casket was carried out to the hearse that would take Agnello Dellacroce to his burial, John Gotti had 11 days to plan, recruit, and execute the murder of a sitting boss, and Paul Castellano had given him the justification he needed by failing to show up to say goodbye. What John Gotti organized in the 10 days between December 5th and December 16th, 1985, was not just a murder, but a violation of the organizational rules that had governed the American Mafia since 1931. The commission, established by Lucky Luciano after the Castellamarese War, existed to prevent exactly this kind of internal conflict. The rules were clear. A boss could only be killed with the approval of the other bosses on the commission. This requirement existed to prevent family wars, to ensure that leadership transitions did not destabilize the entire organizational structure, and to maintain the fiction that the Mafia operated according to rules rather than according to whoever had the most guns and the least restraint. Killing a boss without commission approval was the most serious violation a made member could commit. The penalty, if the other families chose to enforce it, was death for everyone involved. Gotti was planning to violate that rule, and his calculation was that he could get away with it because Paul Castellano was weak, unpopular under federal indictment, and seen by the other families as a liability rather than an asset. The other bosses might be angry about the violation in principle, but Gotti believed they would accept the reality once it was accomplished, particularly if the alternative was a prolonged war that would bring even more federal attention to all 5 families. The core conspirators were John Gotti, Frank DeCicco, and Sammy Gravano. DeCicco's role was crucial. He was close to Castellano, attended meetings with him regularly, and had access to information about Castellano's schedule and security arrangements that Gotti and Gravano did not have. DeCicco was also the conspirator with the best connections to the other families, particularly the Genovese family, and his involvement would be essential if the goal was to legitimize the hit after the fact and prevent retaliation from the commission. Gravano brought operational expertise, a crew of trusted soldiers, and a reputation for violence that made him the logical choice to oversee the actual mechanics of the murder. The planning required recruiting shooters, men who could be trusted to carry out the hit and who would not talk if they were arrested. The exact identities of the 4 shooters who actually pulled the triggers at Sparks Steakhouse remain disputed in various sources, but they were most likely lower-level soldiers and associates from Gotti's and Gravano's crews, men who understood that participating in the murder of a boss was either the fastest route to advancement or the fastest route to getting killed themselves, depending on whether the conspiracy succeeded. The target was not just Paul Castellano, it was also Thomas Bellotti, Castellano's bodyguard and driver. Bellotti was loyal, dangerous, and would almost certainly retaliate if Castellano was killed and Bellotti survived. The plan required killing both men simultaneously. The location selected was Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street in Manhattan. Castellano had a dinner meeting scheduled there for the evening of December 16th. The intelligence about the meeting almost certainly came from Frank DeCicco, who may have been invited to attend and who would have known the time and location well in advance. The method was a classic mob hit: four shooters positioned outside the restaurant, waiting for Castellano to arrive, opening fire the moment he stepped out of his car, and escaping on foot before police could respond. The shooters would wear identical clothing, trench coats and fur hats according to witness descriptions, to make individual identification more difficult. Getaway cars would be positioned on nearby streets. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano would observe from a parked car approximately 1 block away, close enough to confirm the hit was successful, but far enough to avoid being directly implicated if something went wrong. The timing was set for early evening, approximately 5:26 in the evening, based on Castellano's expected arrival time at the restaurant. The weapons would be handguns, likely 38 caliber revolvers, standard for this kind of close-range work. The plan was to fire multiple shots into both targets, confirm they were dead, and leave the scene immediately. Speed and violence were the operational principles. The longer the shooters remained on the street, the higher the likelihood of witnesses providing useful descriptions or police arriving before the escape was complete. The aftermath strategy was almost as important as the murder itself. Gotti would initially claim he had nothing to do with the killing, creating plausible deniability while he moved to consolidate control of the family. DeCicco would use his connections to reach out to the other families, particularly the Genovese family, and explain that Castellano had been removed because he was weak under indictment and incapable of leading the Gambino family through the federal pressure all five families were facing. The argument would be that the hit was regrettable but necessary, that the Commission's approval had not been sought because there was no time, and that the alternative would have been a leadership vacuum that federal prosecutors would have exploited. The risk, if the plan failed, was total. If the shooters missed, if Castellano survived, if the conspiracy was exposed before the hit could be carried out, everyone involved would be killed. Not arrested, not prosecuted, but killed by Castellano's loyalists or by the Commission as a lesson about what happens when the rules are violated. The risk from the other families, if the plan succeeded, was also substantial but more manageable. The Genovese family in particular, led by Vincent Gigante, would be furious about the Commission rule violation. But Gigante was cautious, disciplined, and unlikely to start a war unless he was certain he could win it. Gotti calculated that the other families would complain, would make their displeasure known, but would ultimately accept the fait accompli, rather than risk the kind of open conflict that would bring federal attention down on everyone. The emotional motivation driving the conspiracy remained what it had been at the funeral. This was for Agnello Dellacroce, for the disrespect Castellano had shown by not attending, for the years of distance and arrogance and corporate restructuring that had alienated the street crews and violated everything Dellacroce had taught Gotti about how a family was supposed to function. The strategic calculation was survival. Castellano would move against Gotti's crew within weeks or months. The drug tape issue was unresolved. Angelo Ruggiero was still vulnerable. Dellacroce's death had removed the only protection. The choice, as Gotti framed it to the others, was to act now or die later. By the evening of December 15th, 1985, John Gotti had assembled four shooters, positioned the getaway vehicles, confirmed the target's schedule, and committed himself to a course of action that would either make him the boss of the Gambino family or get him killed, and there was no longer any way to reverse the decision. At approximately 5:26 in the evening on December 16th, 1985, Paul Castellano stepped out of a dark Lincoln sedan in front of Sparks Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street in Manhattan, and four men in identical trench coats and fur hats were waiting for him. Thomas Bellotti was driving. He parked the car, got out, and began to walk around the vehicle toward the restaurant entrance. Castellano was still emerging from the passenger side when the shooting started. The four men approached rapidly from the sidewalk. They drew handguns. They opened fire at close range with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested this was not the first time any of them had killed someone in public. Paul Castellano was shot 6 times. The bullets struck him in the head and torso. He fell to the pavement immediately. Thomas Bellotti was shot multiple times as he tried to reach for his own weapon. He died next to the car, a few feet from Castellano. The entire sequence, from the moment the first shot was fired to the moment the shooters began to flee, lasted perhaps 10 to 15 seconds. Witnesses on the street scattered. People screamed. The four shooters ran in different directions, disappearing into the early evening crowds on 46th Street and the surrounding blocks. Getaway cars, away, positioned on nearby streets, picked them up and drove away. No one was stopped. No one was immediately arrested. John Gotti and Sammy Gravano observed from a car parked approximately 1 block from the restaurant. They watched the shooting. They waited long enough to confirm that both targets were down and that the shooters had escaped successfully. Then they drove slowly past the scene, close enough to see Paul Castellano's body lying on the sidewalk in a pool of blood, and left the area. The observation was necessary to confirm the hit had been carried out as planned. It was also a demonstration of control, of the willingness to be present at the scene of the crime they had ordered, even if their presence was at one remove from the actual violence. Police arrived within minutes. The crime scene was secured. Both bodies remained on the sidewalk, while investigators photographed the scene, collected evidence, and began interviewing witnesses. The interviews produced descriptions of the shooters, the trench coats and fur hats, the coordinated approach, the rapid escape, but no identifiable details that would lead to arrests. The witnesses who could have provided more specific information either genuinely could not remember useful details in the chaos and fear of the moment, or understood that remembering too much about a mob hit was an excellent way to become the next target. News media arrived quickly. The murder of a Mafia boss in Midtown Manhattan, outside a well-known restaurant, during the evening rush, was front-page news instantly. Photographers captured images of Castellano's body on the street, covered with a sheet, surrounded by police and investigators. The photographs became iconic, reproduced in newspapers and magazines and television broadcasts, the visual representation of the most brazen mob killing in New York City in decades. The murder was identified as a Mafia hit within hours. The speculation about who ordered it began immediately. John Gotti's name surfaced quickly, but there was no evidence connecting him to the scene, no witnesses who could place him near the restaurant, and no immediate basis for an arrest. The FBI and the New York Police Department began parallel investigations. The FBI's organized crime units understood immediately that this was an internal Gambino family dispute. The Castellanos' murder represented a power struggle that had been building for years, and that whoever had ordered the hit was now in control of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. The challenge was proving it. The Mafia's code of silence, omerta, held. No one who knew anything was willing to talk. The shooters had escaped. The physical evidence was minimal. The investigation would continue for years, but in the immediate aftermath of December 16th, 1985, there were no arrests, no confessions, and no clear path to prosecution. Paul Castellano's body lay on the sidewalk outside Sparks Steakhouse for hours, while police investigators photographed the scene and federal agents tried to determine who had just killed the boss of the Gambino crime family, and 1 block away, the man who had ordered the killing was already planning his next move. Within 2 weeks of Paul Castellano's murder, John Gotti had consolidated his position as the new boss of the Gambino crime family, and he accomplished this by doing exactly what he had planned, claiming he had nothing to do with the killing while making sure everyone knew he was now in charge. The claim of non-involvement was pro forma, the kind of statement that had to be made for legal purposes and for the record, but that no one actually believed. The real work was organizational. Gotti moved immediately to fill the leadership vacuum, to bring Castellano's faction under control, and to demonstrate that the family now had a boss who commanded the respect and loyalty of the soldiers in a way Castellano never had. Frank DeCicco became underboss, assuming the position that Agnello Dellacroce had held for 28 years. The choice made strategic sense. DeCicco had been part of the conspiracy, had the connections to the other families that would be necessary to manage their reaction to the unsanctioned hit, and was acceptable to both the Gotti faction and the former Castellano faction as someone who could bridge the divide. Sammy Gravano was elevated to consigliere, the third-ranking position in the family, and would later become underboss after De Chico's death. The promotions rewarded the core conspirators and signaled to the rest of the family that loyalty to Gotti would be rewarded, that the new administration would take care of the people who had supported it, and that the transition was complete. Gotti moved his headquarters from the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Queens to the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. The move was symbolic. The Ravenite had been Dellacroce's headquarters, the place where the old underboss had conducted business for decades, and Gotti taking it over was a statement about lineage and legitimacy. He was claiming Dellacroce's legacy, positioning himself as the continuation of the faction that Dellacroce had led, and establishing his authority in the neighborhood that had been the organizational center of the Gambino family's traditional operations. The consolidation of the family's crews proceeded with less violence than might have been expected. Some Castellano loyalists were demoted or pushed out, but there was no widespread purge. Gotti needed to demonstrate that he could lead the entire family, not just his own faction, and that required bringing the former Castellano crews into the new structure without alienating them completely. The calculus was pragmatic. A divided family would be vulnerable to federal prosecution and to challenges from the other New York families. A unified family, even if that unity was enforced through a combination of respect and fear, would be stronger. The reaction from the other New York families was initially furious. The commission rules had been violated. A boss had been killed without approval. The institutional framework that had governed organized crime for 50 years had been disregarded by a captain who decided he knew better than the system. Vincent Gigante and the Genovese family were particularly angry. Gigante understood discipline and structure in ways that Gotti never would, and the violation of commission protocol was, from Gigante's perspective, the kind of recklessness that destroyed organizations. But the other bosses also understood that Castellano had been weak, under federal indictment, and incapable of leading the Gambino family through the pressure all five families were facing from the Mafia commission trial. They calculated that fighting Gotti would be costly, would bring additional federal attention, and would potentially destabilize their own families if captains started to think that killing the boss was a viable path to advancement. The other families eventually accepted the situation. Accepted as different from approved. They never forgave Gotti for the violation. They never forgot that he had broken the rules, but they chose not to go to war over it, calculating that the costs outweighed the benefits and that Gotti's position was strong enough that removing him would require a level of violence and disruption that no one wanted. By early 1986, Gotti was recognized across the five families as the boss of the Gambino organization. The recognition came with resentment, with suspicion, and with the understanding that if Gotti ever showed weakness, the other families would move against him without hesitation. Gotti's style as boss was immediately and dramatically different from Paul Castellano's approach. Where Castellano had been distant and corporate, Gotti was visible and accessible. Where Castellano had avoided public attention, Gotti seemed to court it. He dressed in expensive tailored suits. He held court at the Ravenite openly, standing outside the club, greeting people, being photographed by journalists and tourists who recognized him from the news coverage. The media began calling him the Dapper Don, a reference to his clothing, and the Teflon Don, a reference to the fact that he had been acquitted in multiple trials and seemed untouchable by prosecutors. Gotti appeared to enjoy the publicity, the celebrity, the sense that he was the most famous gangster in America. The publicity was disastrous from an operational security perspective, but Gotti either did not understand this or did not care. The same visibility that made him famous made him a target for federal law enforcement. The same media attention that fed his ego gave prosecutors the justification they needed to dedicate unlimited resources to building a case against him. The same arrogance that made him believe he was smarter than the FBI made him careless about where he conducted conversations, who he trusted, and what he said when he thought no one was listening. By early 1986, John Gotti had won the power struggle within the Gambino family. He had also set in motion the process that would destroy him. By the spring of 1986, John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino family. The Ravenite Social Club was the most watched building in Little Italy, and the FBI had begun to understand that the man who had killed his way to the top was going to be easier to convict than anyone who had come before him. On April 13th, 1986, 4 months after Paul Castellano's murder, a car bomb exploded outside the Veterans and Friends Social Club in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, and the man who died in the blast was not John Gotti, but his underboss Frank DeCicco, and the message from the other families was clear. The unsanctioned killing of a boss would not go completely unanswered. The bomb had been planted under or near a vehicle parked outside the club. The target was John Gotti, who had been scheduled to meet DeCicco there that afternoon. Gotti changed his plans at the last moment, the kind of random alteration in routine that saves lives in a world where routines get you killed. Frank DeCicco kept the appointment. When he approached the vehicle, the bomb detonated. The explosion killed DeCicco instantly and injured a bystander who had been walking past at the wrong moment. The car bombing was retaliation for Paul Castellano's murder, ordered by Vincent Gigante and the Genovese family, with the knowledge and approval of other commission members. This was the response that Gotti had calculated might come: the enforcement of the rules he had violated, the institutional punishment for killing a boss without permission. The other families could not let Castellano's murder go completely unanswered. Doing so would signal that commission rules no longer mattered, that any ambitious captain could kill his boss and take over, and that the structure that had maintained relative peace and stability for 50 years was no longer operational. But the other families also did not want an all-out war with the Gambino family, did not want the kind of prolonged violent conflict that would bring federal prosecutors down on all of them simultaneously. The car bomb was the middle ground. It was an attempt to kill Gotti, to remove the man who had violated the rules and restore some version of the old order. If the attempt succeeded, the Genovese family and the others could claim they had enforced commission discipline. If it failed, as it did, the point was made. Gotti's actions had consequences. The other families were willing to use violence in response, and Gotti would need to watch his back for the rest of his life. The fact that Frank DeCicco died instead of Gotti was collateral damage, the kind of unintended outcome that happens when bombs are used instead of more precise methods. But the message was delivered regardless of who died. John Gotti's reaction to DeCicco's death was a combination of grief, rage, and calculation. He had lost his underboss, one of the core conspirators in the Castellano hit, a man he had known for years and trusted with his life. He also understood exactly what the bombing represented, a warning that the other families had not accepted his ascension, that the violation of commission rules was still an open account, and that further retaliation was possible if he gave them an opening. Gotti increased his security. He varied his routines. He became more cautious about where he went and who he met in public. But he did not retaliate directly against the Genovese family. Doing so would have started the war that the car bombing was designed to avoid, would have united the other families against him, and would have confirmed every concern they had about his judgment and his respect for the organizational structure. The decision not to retaliate was strategic, one of the few moments in Gotti's tenure as boss where discipline overrode ego. He absorbed the hit, mourned his underboss, and focused on consolidating his control over the Gambino family and generating the revenue that would keep his captains loyal. The car bombing was the last direct attempt on Gotti's life by the other families. After DeCicco's death, the commission grudgingly accepted that John Gotti was the boss of the Gambino family, and that removing him would cost more than it was worth. The acceptance was tactical, not genuine. The resentment remained, particularly within the Genovese family, and the memory of the commission rule violation would be used against Gotti years later when the other families chose not to intervene as federal prosecutors dismantled his organization. Frank DeCicco was buried 6 days later, and John Gotti understood that the car bomb had been the other family's final word on Paul Castellano's murder. They would not accept what he had done, but they would not go to war over it either, and that was as close to legitimacy as a man who had killed his way to the boss position was ever going to get. The publicity that John Gotti courted through the late 1980s made him the most famous mob boss in America and also made him the easiest target the FBI had ever been given. And by 1990, the same building where Agnello Dellacroce had once conducted business with enough discipline to avoid serious prosecution had been wired so thoroughly that every word Gotti said was being recorded. Gotti's leadership style was the opposite of everything Dellacroce had taught him. Where Dellacroce had been invisible, Gotti was conspicuous. Where Dellacroce had avoided cameras, Gotti posed for them. Where Dellacroce had understood that the most successful criminals are the ones nobody knows about, Gotti believed that being famous made him untouchable. He was wrong. Through the late 1980s, Gotti held weekly meetings at the Ravenite Social Club with his captains and key members of his administration. The meetings were predictable in timing, location, and attendance. The FBI photographed everyone who entered and left. Agents mapped the organizational structure by documenting who met with whom, how often, and in what context. The Bureau obtained court authorization to install electronic surveillance in the building, specifically in an apartment above the social club where Gotti held his most sensitive conversations. The bugs were sophisticated, capable of capturing clear audio even when multiple people were talking, and they were positioned in locations that Gotti believed were secure. The recordings captured hundreds of hours of conversations over a period of months. Gotti discussed murders, including his role in ordering Paul Castellano's killing. He discussed racketeering operations, the division of territory among crews, the resolution of disputes, and the enforcement of family discipline. He also critically criticized his subordinates in language that demonstrated his lack of respect for the men who worked for him. The tapes captured Gotti complaining about Sammy Gravano, questioning his loyalty, and discussing him in ways that made it clear Gotti viewed Gravano as useful but subordinate. These criticisms, when Gravano eventually heard them after his arrest, would become one of the factors that led him to cooperate with federal prosecutors. On December 11, 1990, John Gotti, Sammy Gravano, and Frank Locascio were arrested and charged with racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. The indictment was comprehensive, built on the FBI recordings, on testimony from cooperating witnesses, and on financial records that demonstrated the gap between Gotti's reported income and his actual expenditures. The charges carried potential sentences that amounted to life in prison. Gotti had been arrested before, had been acquitted in multiple trials, and genuinely believed that his record of beating federal cases meant he would beat this one as well. He was confident, dismissive of the prosecutors, and convinced that his lawyers could create reasonable doubt about the FBI tapes and the testimony of witnesses who had turned against the family. Sammy Gravano faced the same charges and the same potential life sentence. By late 1991, it was clear that the evidence against both men was strong, potentially overwhelming. The FBI had Gotti on tape discussing criminal activity in detail. Gravano's role in multiple murders, including the Castellano hit, was documented in the same recordings. The calculation Gravano made was cold and pragmatic. The FBI approached him with an offer: cooperate, testify against Gotti, and receive a reduced sentence instead of life in prison. Gravano had been loyal to Gotti for years, had participated in the conspiracy that made Gotti boss, and had served as his underboss, but he had also heard the tapes of Gotti criticizing him, understood that Gotti felt no particular loyalty toward him, and recognized that spending the rest of his life in prison to protect a man who did not respect him was a transaction that made no sense. In November of 1991, Sammy Gravano agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. The decision was seismic. Gravano was not a low-level associate or a fringe member. He was the underboss of the Gambino family, a made member for decades, someone who had participated directly in 19 murders, and who could provide testimony about the family's operations that no previous cooperating witness had been able to provide. His cooperation guaranteed that Gotti would be convicted. The trial began in April of 1992 in federal court in Brooklyn. Gravano testified in detail about the Gambino family's structure, its revenue sources, and the murders he and Gotti had committed or ordered. He confirmed that Gotti had ordered Paul Castellano's murder, described the planning and execution of the hit, and placed Gotti at the scene, observing the shooting. Combined with the FBI recordings, Gravano's testimony was devastating. On April 2nd, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days. The verdict was unanimous. On June 23, 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a supermax facility where he was held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. He was later transferred to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, when his health began to fail. John Gotti died in prison on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. The cause was throat cancer, the same disease of the throat and voice that had defined his public persona, now ending his life. He had been boss of the Gambino family for less than 6 years. He had spent the last 10 years of his life in federal prison, most of it in isolation, unable to communicate with his family or control the organization he had destroyed the family to lead. The Gambino family continued to exist after his conviction, but it never recovered the power or influence it had held under Carlo Gambino, or even under Paul Castellano. Gotti's tenure as boss, his high-profile style, and his ultimate conviction had brought so much federal attention to the family that its operations were permanently compromised. John Gotti died in a federal prison medical facility on June 10, 2002, 17 years after he had stood at Agnello Dellacroce's funeral and decided to kill the boss who had failed to attend, and the organization he had destroyed the family to control had been decimated by the same federal government that had never managed to seriously threaten the man who taught him everything except how to survive. The funeral on December 5, 1985, was not just the end of Agnello Dellacroce's life. It was the end of an approach to organized crime that had sustained the Gambino family through decades of federal pressure, the end of the discipline that kept men like Dellacroce out of prison despite lifetimes spent in criminal enterprises, and the beginning of an era where visibility replaced discretion and ego replaced structure. What happened in the 14 days between Dellacroce's death and Paul Castellano's murder was the hinge on which the entire history of the Gambino family turned. Before December 2nd, the family was divided but functional, profitable, and capable of weathering the federal prosecutions that were dismantling other organizations. After December 16th, the family was unified under a boss whose need for recognition would bring the same federal attention that Dellacroce had spent 28 years avoiding. Agnello Dellacroce represented loyalty to structure over personal ambition. He was passed over for the boss position in 1976, when Carlo Gambino chose Paul Castellano instead, and he could have started a war over that decision. He had the support, the respect, and the operational control to fracture the family and take his faction independent. He chose loyalty instead, accepted the arrangement, and spent the next 9 years holding the organization together through discipline and the authority he commanded among men who understood that respect was earned through consistency and presence, not through corporate reorganization and mansion living. He served as underboss under Gambino and then under Castellano for 28 years, longer than most men in that position survive, and he did so by understanding that the structure mattered more than any individual within it. John Gotti learned tactics from Dellacroce, but not strategy. He learned how to run a crew, how to manage soldiers, how to generate revenue through the traditional rackets, but he never absorbed the deeper lesson about invisibility and discipline. Gotti wanted to be known, wanted to be photographed, wanted to be the most famous gangster in America. He achieved that goal. The fame destroyed him. By the time he was convicted in 1992, he had been boss for less than 6 years, and in that time he had brought more federal attention to the Gambino family than any boss before him. The FBI surveillance that captured him on tape discussing crimes, the media coverage that made him a household name, the witnesses who cooperated because they understood that Gotti's arrogance had made their own convictions inevitable, all of it flowed directly from the leadership style that Dellacroce would never have tolerated. Paul Castellano's absence from the funeral was the mistake that cost him his life, but it was also a symptom of the deeper problem with his leadership. He did not understand that in an organization built on personal relationships and respect, distance is weakness. He believed that running the Gambino family like a corporation with layers of management and a focus on profit margins would make it more successful and more sustainable. He was partly right. The family was extremely profitable under his leadership. The construction rackets generated millions. But profit without loyalty is a fragile foundation. And when Dellacroce died and removed the only person who could enforce loyalty to a boss, the soldiers did not respect. The structure collapsed in exactly the way Dellacroce had prevented for 9 years. If Paul Castellano had attended Agnello Dellacroce's funeral, he might have survived. The attendance would not have solved the underlying problems, would not have made him more respected by the street crews, would not have prevented the eventual confrontation with Gotti's faction over the drug tapes and Angelo Ruggiero, but it would have removed the immediate emotional catalyst, the personal insult that made the conspiracy irreversible in the minds of the men planning it. Gotti might have hesitated, might have calculated that the risks outweighed the benefits, might have waited for a better moment or a clearer justification. The absence gave him the justification. The disrespect at the funeral became the public rationale that made recruiting other conspirators possible, that allowed Gotti to frame the murder as enforcement of the old rules against a boss who had violated them, rather than as naked ambition and a power grab. If Agnello Dellacroce had lived another year, Paul Castellano would almost certainly have survived. Dellacroce would have continued to protect Gotti's crew, would have managed the drug tape crisis, would have prevented Castellano from moving against Ruggiero, and would have held the peace through the combination of respect and authority that he had always used. Gotti would not have moved against Castellano while Dellacroce was alive, because doing so would have meant moving against the man he considered a father, violating the loyalty that defined his relationship with Dellacroce, and risking the condemnation of the one person whose opinion mattered to him. The cancer that killed Dellacroce in December of 1985 removed the last restraint on forces that had been building for years, and the timing, coming at the exact moment when Castellano was under federal indictment and most vulnerable, made the outcome nearly inevitable. The institutional memory of the other families never forgot what John Gotti did or how he did it. The Genovese family, led by Vincent Gigante, remained furious about the commission rule violation for the rest of Gigante's life. When Gotti was arrested and prosecuted in the early 1990s, the other families did not intervene, did not use their influence to obstruct the investigation, did not provide the kind of institutional support that might have made the federal case more difficult to build. They watched him get convicted and sent to prison, and they calculated that his removal was better for everyone, that his visibility and recklessness had brought too much attention to organized crime generally, and that the sooner he was gone, the sooner the heat would diminish. The Gambino family never recovered the power it held under Carlo Gambino or even under Paul Castellano. Gotti's conviction, Gravano's cooperation, and the decade of FBI surveillance that followed decimated the organization. By the time Gotti died in 2002, the Gambino family was a shadow of what it had been, its leadership imprisoned or dead, its operations compromised by cooperating witnesses and electronic surveillance, its reputation destroyed by the same publicity that Gotti had courted. Other families survived the federal prosecutions of the 1980s and 90s with their core structures intact. The Gambino family did not, and the reason was the leadership style that Gotti brought to the position he killed to obtain. Agnello Dellacroce is remembered by historians and by the few remaining members of his generation as one of the last old-school mobsters, a man who understood that the most effective criminals are invisible, that loyalty to the structure is what keeps an organization functional across decades, and that respect is built through consistency and discipline rather than through flash and publicity. He was never successfully prosecuted for a serious crime Despite spending his entire adult life in organized crime, he served as underboss for 28 years, survived multiple regime changes, and died of natural causes in a hospital bed rather than on a street corner or in a prison cell. By the measures that matter in that world, his career was a success. John Gotti is remembered as the boss whose ego destroyed his family, the man who wanted to be famous more than he wanted to be effective, the case study in how not to run a criminal organization in an era of electronic surveillance and cooperating witnesses. He was boss for less than 6 years. He spent the last 10 years of his life in federal prison. The family he led was permanently weakened by his tenure. The federal government that had struggled for decades to penetrate the Gambino family found Gotti easy to prosecute because he made himself visible, predictable, and careless. The contrast between Dellacroce's 40-year career and Gotti's 6-year reign is the contrast between discipline and recklessness, between structure and chaos, between a man who understood how to survive and a man who thought survival was guaranteed by reputation. The funeral itself is remembered in organized crime history as the moment everything changed, the gathering where the absence of one man mattered more than the presence of hundreds, the event that set in motion a chain of violence and retaliation and federal prosecution that did not end until John Gotti died in a prison hospital 17 years later. Castellano's failure to attend is studied as a case study in leadership failure, in the importance of ritual and gesture in organizations where formal authority is always contested and respect is the only currency that matters. The absence communicated disrespect, weakness, and contempt for the men who had served under Dellacroce, and it gave those men the justification they needed to violate the most fundamental rule of the organization they claimed to serve. The man in the casket had spent his entire career preventing exactly what happened after his death. He had held the family together through loyalty, discipline, and respect for the structure. He had taught John Gotti everything about how to run a crew, how to manage soldiers, how to generate revenue and maintain operations under federal pressure. He had not taught him, or perhaps Gotti had not learned, that the point of all that discipline was survival, that the organization mattered more than any individual's ambition, and that the moment you started believing the rules did not apply to you, you had begun the process of destroying everything you claimed to value. Dellacroce would not have approved of the Castellano hit. His loyalty to the structure, even when that structure had passed him over for promotion, even when that structure was run by a man he did not particularly respect, would have prevented him from sanctioning an unsanctioned murder. But Dellacroce was dead, and the protection he had provided died with him. The final image is December 5th, 1985. Scarpaci Funeral Home, the casket at the front of the room, the gathered family, the prayers and the flowers and the grief, the empty space where Paul Castellano should have been standing. Everything that followed, the conspiracy, the murder outside Sparks Steakhouse, the car bomb that killed Frank DeSico, the FBI surveillance, Sammy Gravano's cooperation, John Gotti's conviction and imprisonment and death, the permanent weakening of the Gambino family, all of it traced back to that absence. The funeral was not just a goodbye to Agnello Dellacroce. It was the moment when the old rules stopped working, when personal ambition replaced institutional loyalty, when the structure that had held the Gambino family together for 5 decades fractured under the weight of resentment and disrespect and the death of the one man who had the authority to prevent the fracture from becoming permanent. 14 days was all the time it took for grief to become rage, for rage to become conspiracy, and for conspiracy to become the murder that changed everything.